You know, one thing that is not told to us frequently is that in the weeks approaching the Afghan campaign after that terrible, terrible shock on 9/11, the Taliban government in Afghanistan firstly offered to try Osama bin Laden themselves, and then they offered to extradite him to a third country so that he may be extradited to the United States. The only condition they put upon it is that the evidence that the US had gathered about his guilt, because at that time he hadn't come out publicly and admitted that he was responsible, be presented to the Afghan government. But the US government at the time said that this was a condition, and therefore no conditions could be considered. And the bombing started. The rights and wrongs of the Afghan campaign can be argued until we're blue in the face. But we are still the we. We can't separate ourselves from the consequences of what was done in our name. It wasn't only done by America, it was done by my country as well. And the British government is tearing itself apart at the moment because of the revelation that MI6, the British Secret Services, were complicit with the CIA in the rendition process of taking people to black prisons in foreign countries, secret flights at night, all that business. Really, I suppose we made that decision. Are we the sort of people who do that? Do we live in the sort of countries that do that? Because it seems to me that it was an ultimate fulfillment of all the bile that was thrown at the West by the extremists when we do exactly what they say we would do as soon as it becomes hard. As soon as it becomes really difficult and challenging, our Christianity disappears. And we find ourselves torturing people for weeks and standing by whilst Moroccans put electricity into people's genitalia in prisons in Rabat in our name. Then all of a sudden, we start being exactly what they said we were. And here we are 10 years after the day. And in some ways, I think we live in a darker world. The response has been overwhelmingly negative. And we never looked at why we went from a situation whereby 15 years before 9/11, actually, global views of the US were very positive indeed, very positive. In the Arab world, the US was very highly thought of, especially in those countries where people had been oppressed for a long, long time. The US was seen as that beacon of liberty. To the situation that we have now, which is very different to that, whereby all of those countries, my own country, the US, the countries of NATO, which stood together on this issue, are now regarded with almost universal hatred by about a third of the world's population. You cannot have a reservoir of 1 billion people who despise you, and there never be some sort of response from that. Are we going to have to guard ourselves day by day, night by night, forever? Can't go on. There has to be another response to it. Christian forgiveness is always looked upon as a bit wet. Christian forgiveness is abandoned almost as soon as there's something worth forgiving. All the while, there's nothing really to forgive. Just excuse a bit of awkward behavior. We're fine with the concept of forgiveness. But as soon as there really is something that we need to forgive, God help us all, we forget. We forget. I want to read you something, if I may. As the Allied soldiers moved into Europe during the end of the Second World War, they discovered the concentration camps. The enormities inflicted upon the inmates of these places, and many others throughout Europe, were upon the weak, the sick, the different, and the dispossessed, the very people civilization should protect. In fact, one of the definitions of civilization is an organization of people who has begun to take care of the weakest and the disregarded. You want to see how a civilization treats its sick, its disabled, and its animals. if you want to see just how much of a civilization it is. Crimes like the Counts haven't ended. They still occur in different forms throughout the world today. The crimes of Belsen, Auschwitz, Oranienburg, Ravensbrück, and many others were the ultimate betrayal by the state of its people, and they still haunt our memories today. But as the Allied troops moved east, they encountered Ravensbrück. A small party of soldiers entered the camp and found amongst the dead the emaciated body of a child, one of countless children. Tucked into the rags that the child wore was an anonymous prayer that reduced the soldiers to tears and represented a victory over the Nazi regime. It read, "Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted upon us. Instead, remember the fruits we have borne because of this suffering, our fellowship, our loyalty to one another, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown from this trouble. When our persecutors come to be judged by you, let all those fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness." This prayer isn't a call for vengeance, or even a cry to God for release from pain and suffering. It's a prayer for forgiveness. The forgiveness of God on their tormentors, on their murderers. By writing this, it's clear that even in the midst of death, they've been able to forgive. Forgiveness is not the same as acceptance or indifference. The writer of the prayer did not release their persecutors from the consequences of their actions, as that belongs to God and to God alone. But they hadn't allowed their persecutors to take away their power to forgive, and therefore had ceased to be victims and had become victors. There's a terrible temptation to steal other people's pain and use it as a stick to go to war with. To steal other people's pain and suffering and use it as a stick to beat God with, to beat one another. It's not ours to do that with. The truth is that most of us here had a very traumatic day and watched the television and heard of horrible things that happened. That's the truth of the matter. It is to those who have experienced the most profound pain and loss that the right to decide about forgiveness must go. It is to the victims of Ravensbrück, not to us who are disturbed by hearing about it. It is to the real victims of those who have experienced pain to offer forgiveness. And forgiveness transfigures them from mere victims, from mere statistics, into being examples, grand human beings, people who are lifted up, and whoever wrote that note and tucked it into the rags of a dead child or a dying child had forgiven the very people who probably were responsible for torturing and killing their own child. It's not good enough for me to just steal that to make a bias point, to build a sermon around. We have to really consider the nature of forgiveness. And whether it matters to us, it might not. It might not. Maybe we've already made that decision. Maybe we've already made the decision that we really probably know what Jesus would have done under these circumstances, but we don't like it, we don't want to do it. But let's not call ourselves a Christian country. If that is the case, let's at least have the honesty to accept that that is not what we are.